Buenos dias. My name is Mark Magana, and I am the founding president and CEO of Green Latinos. We are an active comunidad of Latino, Latina, Latinx leaders, emboldened by the power and wisdom of our culture, united to demand equity and dismantle racism, resourced to win our environmental conservation and climate justice battles, and driven to secure our political, economic, cultural, and environmental liberation. We are so grateful to be partnering with Earth Justice and Southern Environmental Law Center, or SELC, to make this important PFAS town hall happen. One of our organization's policy priorities is water equity, because agua es vida, mini wachoni. We believe that water is a human right, and that everyone, including our Latino, Latina, Latinx communities, has the right to clean, reliable, and affordable water. This includes healthy rivers and watersheds free of toxic forever chemicals that are poisoning our waters and foods, such as PFAS. We are happy to be joined today by U.S. Senator and New York Senator Gillibrand and U.S. Representative of New Hampshire, Representative Pappas. We are also joined by a panel of legal experts, scientists, and organizers working on PFAS. Today's town hall will focus on how to advance equitable clean water and drinking water policies in the United States that meaningfully address the ever-growing PFAS crisis. We hope that this is going to be a lively discussion and that there will be opportunity for questions throughout the town hall. If you have any questions, please insert them in the Q&A box as we go along on Zoom or through comments if you're watching over Facebook. So thank you for joining us. And with that, we'd like to turn it over to a video presentation by Senator Gillibrand from New York.
Hi everyone, it's Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. First, I want to start by saying thank you to Earth Justice, Green Latinos, and the Southern Environmental Law Center for hosting this important town hall to discuss how we can best protect our drinking water from toxic PFAS chemicals. And to my colleague, Congressman Chris Pappas, for working with me on our bicameral Clean Water Standards for PFAS Act. Thank you all for your leadership, partnership, and advocacy on clean water and PFAS. PFAS are known as forever chemicals because they don't break down in the environment. When people are exposed, PFAS can build up in their bodies and lead to serious disease, including cancers, immune system dysfunction, and birth defects. That's what has happened to far too many constituents and communities across my home state of New York, where runoff from industrial manufacturing sites contaminated the drinking water supplies of the surrounding communities, ultimately leading to adverse health impacts across generations of families. These chemicals have gone unregulated for far too long and continue to needlessly put the health of millions of Americans at risk every day. Currently, the Environmental Protection Agency does not regulate the amounts of PFAS chemicals that can be discharged into our nation's water bodies. This means that polluters can dump as much toxic PFAS waste into our water bodies as they want, since no effluent standards for PFAS currently exist under the Clean Water Act. This puts the health and safety of millions of Americans at risk and results in costly cleanup and treatment activities to remove PFAS contamination. To fix this grave error, I am proud to have reintroduced key legislation with Congressman Pappas, the Clean Water Standards for PFAS Act of 2021, which would help stop toxic levels of PFAS from entering water sources in the first place. Specifically, our bill sets deadlines for the EPA to issue standards that polluters must meet before discharging PFAS waste into our water bodies. This includes establishing pre-treatment standards to stop PFAS at the source before it gets into the municipal water system. Additionally, our bill expands the industry category list that the EPA must look into developing effluent standards for and authorizes federal dollars for a new grant program at the EPA to help publicly owned water treatment works with the implementation of such standards. Communities across the country are struggling to respond to the human health and environmental threat posed by PFAS contamination. And I want to once again thank all of you for holding this important and urgent conversation. We must do everything in our power to hold polluters accountable and develop clear standards for all meaningful and measurable PFAS to protect our drinking water sources and public health. I continue and I will continue to work with my colleagues in both the House and the Senate to get this legislation passed into law, because having access to clean drinking water is a human right.
Thank you for that important message, Senator Gillibrand. So we're going to move on now. Turn it over to Congressman Pappas from New Hampshire's 1st Congressional District. Congressman Pappas, thank you for joining us today and for all your hard work on this issue that you've done throughout your career.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, to you, to Green Latinos, and all the organizations who have helped put this event together today. I'm really pleased to be able to join you. And thanks to all the interested individuals, community activists, and others who are part of this conversation, who are ensuring that this is going to be an important year for us in addressing these forever chemicals and making sure that we are truly allowing each and every American, regardless of what community you're a part of or where you live, to have access to clean and safe drinking water. That is a basic human right. Unfortunately, many communities in my district and hundreds across the country have been forced to contend with unsafe drinking water because of forever chemicals known as PFAS. And I think it's critically important that we see some forward progress on this, working with the Biden administration and also working on the legislative front. And I hope to be able to talk with you a little bit about legislation that I've introduced that we are really eager to see pass this Congress. It's just unacceptable that every American doesn't have access to clean and safe drinking water. I can't tell you how many people I talk to in my district who are worried about what comes out of their tap, whether or not they can bathe their kids, what their background level of contamination might be from PFAS as they've been exposed over years and years, and what that means to the health of their family moving forward. So there are so many important questions we have to answer, and we have to make sure that we are safeguarding the health of the American people and our environment. There is nothing more important that our government can do than that. We know that PFAS poses significant risks to kids and families. It's linked to health problems ranging from asthma to cancer to liver damage. We know we have work to do to expand access to testing. We've got to make sure that there is better health information available to individuals about the risks that PFAS pose. We also have to strengthen regulations around PFAS contamination in order to protect the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the environment that we are all connected to. So the legislation that I've introduced, along with Senator Gillibrand in the Senate, it's a bipartisan bill called the Clean Water Standards PFAS Act. It's based on the notion that we should be regulating these toxic chemicals under the Clean Water Act. It would require EPA to do so, to publish human health water quality criteria under the Clean Water Act for measurable PFAS substances. The bill would also require EPA to establish effluent limitation and pre-treatment standards for PFAS for specific priority industry categories like chemical companies and textile mills that we know are among the worst polluters and purveyors of PFAS in our country. They've got to be held accountable for this. And finally, it also supports publicly owned treatment works by authorizing $1 billion in grant funding to assist these publicly owned treatment works to comply with federal guidelines and to make sure we're just not perpetuating this contamination in the environment, that we're doing something to actually stop it at its source and clean it up. The legislation is really important because it would require EPA to address existing PFAS contamination and hold these polluters accountable. It would make sure that we are protecting our waterways and our drinking water sources. It would provide funding to address PFAS, and that in itself isn't enough. We've got to make sure, as I said, that we're stopping this PFAS contamination from continuing to be present in our environment. They're called forever chemicals for a reason. They persist in the environment and in the human body. I'm really grateful for, I think, the increased awareness and understanding that exists across the country on this. I like to say that I've been informed by the families, the medical community, the local activists in my district who helped raise awareness about this in New Hampshire. We've seen a significant amount of action on the state level and interest among our federal delegation in this issue because of the experience that families are going through. And they have taught us along the way. And I think in talking with some of my colleagues all across the country, they've had that same experience. So I'm really pleased that we're going to see some major progress, I believe, this year. We have a bill that was just marked up by the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House that is the PFAS Action Act. It's an omnibus PFAS bill that is sponsored by Debbie Dingell, includes our specific provisions on the Clean Water Act, but many other provisions that seek to test, to treat, and to go after the polluters. And it's a bill that passed in the last Congress. We're hopeful we can get over the finish line here in this Congress. So we're going to really be working on all fronts on this issue. And I just want to thank you all again for having an interest in this. I think we need to continue to keep the conversation going, need to understand where PFAS is manifesting itself across the country. It's pretty well documented that we have hundreds of industrial sites that are actively discharging PFAS today into the environment, into the waters of this country. We have legacy contamination at active and former military bases that number in the hundreds. So in real time, this is having an impact on the health and well-being of the American people. We've got to do all we can to stop it, to regulate it, to make sure that people are healthy moving forward. And I think some of the legislation we're seeing proposed in Congress this year will do that in a meaningful way. So thanks again for the opportunity to join you. Look forward to any questions you might have as well.
Thank you, Congressman Pappas. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here and your prioritization of these issues and of your district. Our first question comes from Ev Cruden with E&E. Republicans and industry members have argued against regulating PFAS as a class due to their presence in medical equipment like heart stents. Recently, those arguments have begun including masks like the surgical kind that have become commonplace during the pandemic. Are lawmakers considering essential use exemptions for products like those?
Well, clearly no one wants to limit the availability of life-saving medical equipment, and the uses of PFAS in devices like heart stents is very well documented. And I think what our bill aims to do is to go after specific industry categories to make sure that EPA is coming forward with regulations. We have known that PFAS is toxic for decades, but we haven't seen regulation, and we're calling for that. We do expect that the new administration has an increased interest in working with policymakers on this front, but we believe the legislative arena is the one place we can move forward with some lasting change and really hold EPA and other regulators' feet to the fire. So this is an important conversation. The scientific community is, and medical community, we have to continue to lean on them to make sure that, that our legislation is well informed. And much has been written about the need to regulate PFAS as a class. I think we've got to focus on the threat to human health, the threat to our environment, and where these regulations can help improve those things and make sure we're doing well by our constituents. I think absolutely regulation is well warranted. But I think we can have that. We can have a safe, clean environment and have groundbreaking medical products and safety devices that we all need. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive.
Thank you. Now that your bill's been introduced and you referenced it a couple times, how do you see the process going forward to make sure that this bill moves forward, hopefully, and gets passed and signed into law?
Well, the House has passed it on a few separate occasions, and actually we've got an opportunity this week to move it forward as part of a water and infrastructure bill that's moving through the House. So we're offering an amendment that contains the text of our legislation, as well as that $1 billion authorization that I mentioned for publicly owned treatment works to be able to clean up PFAS contamination and protect our environment and drinking water. So that's one step that we're taking immediately, but I think we really need an all of the above approach to get something done. The National Defense Authorization Act has been one place that we have looked over the last few years to make some progress on PFAS. We've come up with dates certain in the future where we have to phase out the use of firefighting foam, which is rich in PFOA and PFOS. That was accomplished because we know our military bases are sites of this contamination. And I've seen that in my district. We see that hundreds of other places across the country. So we're really looking at where it makes sense to raise this argument. And I think as we talk about infrastructure, as we talk about a bill that can create jobs, make some investments in this country, we've got to be talking about our water infrastructure, our wastewater treatment facilities, and that goes hand in hand with making sure that we're protecting our environment and public health. So that's a great place to go. I did also mention that the Energy and Commerce Committee has been working on Debbie Dingell's bill, the PFAS Action Act. I would hope we would see that on the floor. We worked with leadership during the last session of Congress to make sure that we got a vote in the House on that. And that brought together most of the Democratic caucus and a few dozen Republicans as well, who felt that this was an important issue where we needed to see some action. We've been contending with, for the better part of the last few years during the last administration with a PFAS action plan that was never acted on. And the time to act has long passed. And that's why we really are going to be pushing legislation that can help, that can protect public health and safety, that can give people the health information that they need to stop this contamination at its source, and to make sure our communities can move forward in an equitable way.
Well, great. And finally, Congressman, is there a companion Senate bill? And then two-part second question is, how can people best support these efforts to require the EPA to develop affluent limitation guidelines and standards covering the industries that use PFAS?
Well, we've worked with Senator Gillibrand on this on this legislation, and so there is legislation in the Senate as well. And we need to be working on both sides of the Capitol on this issue. And again, this is an issue where there's significant bipartisan concern across the Congress. If you look at some of the states that where we've seen some early and well-documented PFAS contamination, places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, these are places that have bipartisan delegations here in Washington that have a great deal of interest in this issue. So I think as we see the beginnings of a bipartisan agreement on infrastructure, as we know, we've got to take other steps to achieve climate justice and progress with respect to cleaning up our environment. PFAS needs to be front and center in that conversation. And so I was pleased to see the administration include that in their outline of the jobs plan. And I hope in addition to achieving some new regulations, passing some of these provisions, we can get some funding that will really help our communities address this contamination, and also make some smart investments along the way.
Well, thank you, Congressman. Again, thank you for taking the time to join us. Thank you for representing the people of the 1st District in New Hampshire so well and fighting for their health and the health of their children. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much.
Appreciate it. We now turn to our first couple of speakers, our first small panel. Christine Santayana, who is a legislative counsel for the Healthy Communities Program at Earth Justice, and Jeff Gisler, who is SELC's senior attorney and leader of SELC's Clean Water Program. Welcome, Christine and Jeff.
Thank you so much, Mark. I want to take a moment first to thank Congressman Pappas for kicking us off and raising such critical points that highlight the very reasons why I think we all felt compelled to show up and discuss this issue. And also to Senator Gillibrand, although she wasn't able to be here, for her important remarks and for both of their leadership on PFAS. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to join this wonderful panel, and want to say thank you to Green Latinos and SELC for allowing me to participate and support the reintroduction of the Clean Water Standards for PFAS Act in both the House and the Senate. Addressing the PFAS crisis at the federal level has been a priority for Earth Justice, and I'm happy to see the immense national attention that has been brought to this issue. Earth Justice cares not only about getting these toxic and persistent chemicals regulated, but equally about protecting communities from the dangers associated with PFAS, from residents in Hoosick Falls, New York, whose water has been severely contaminated by Saint-Gobain, to East Liverpool, Ohio, where the Department of Defense incinerated PFAS waste, emitting these chemicals and toxic byproducts into the air. It's our most vulnerable populations, like Latinx and other communities of color, who are often overburdened by environmental pollution. My colleague Michelle will speak a little bit more to this, but I just think it's really critical that we bring real life impacts to the forefront so that we can empower Congress and the EPA to take bold action on regulating toxic PFAS. A great development has been the House PFAS Task Force, which has continued to expand, and we're thankful for all of the congressional champions, including Senator Gillibrand and Congressman Pappas, who are continuously working to ensure that these forever chemicals are properly regulated and that polluters are held responsible for cleaning up contamination across the country in both blue and red states alike, since, as we know, PFAS impacts us all. And because PFAS are so ubiquitous, there are various approaches that we can take and must take to reduce risk to our communities. And we're seeing growing federal legislation to address PFAS. But today we're here to focus on our latest approach to diminishing PFAS pollution in our water. Water is a human right, and majority of our bodies are made up of water. We literally need it to survive, and yet over 100 million people in the United States, disproportionately populations that are low income and communities of color, drink from systems that are polluted. And how do PFAS get into our drinking water? One of the main pathways is through industrial discharges. They don't have to measure for PFAS or limit them, so these toxic chemicals are discharged into our lakes and streams, which ultimately serve as our drinking water sources. And although the new administration is gearing into action on PFAS, communities simply cannot afford to wait, and we need hard deadlines for EPA to act. The Clean Water Standards for PFAS Act takes several important steps, which were highlighted, including requiring EPA to set PFAS discharge limits for 9 priority industry categories when they discharge into waterways or sewage treatment plants, setting aside money to help communities to enforce these industrial standards. It requires EPA to develop health-based water quality criteria that will ultimately limit discharges of PFAS into waters across the country. The funding measures are really crucial to improving water quality standards, and the $200 million that this bill provides for water treatment system will go towards any equipment or technological upgrades that might be needed to treat the water before it's discharged. I look forward to working with both Congressman Pappas and Senator Gillibrand to move these bills quickly and to build a bipartisan coalition in Congress to implement these much needed limitations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark and Christine. And thank you to Senator Gillibrand and Representative Pappas for this important bill. I think Christine just gave a great overview of that. And I want to thank our partners at Green Latinos and Earth Justice for helping organize this event. So it's critical that we have these nationwide standards that are in this bill, but I want to talk about a few parts of the Clean Water Act that are essential for us to take advantage of now if we are to have the information we need to take full use of these standards when they're implemented and to protect our communities between now and when these standards become law. And the best way for me to explain that is to give you an example from North Carolina, where I'm located and where I work. And that comes from about 4 years ago, when hundreds of thousands of people in southeastern North Carolina woke up and discovered that for decades, DuPont and a company called Chemours had been dumping PFAS into the Cape Fear River. The Cape Fear River provides drinking water for hundreds of thousands of North Carolinians. And they had no idea that they had been drinking this contaminated water. The North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality brought an enforcement action against Chemours when news of this pollution broke. And that enforcement action, I think it gives us 2 important lessons that if we implement now, we can not only get cleaner water soon, but we can set the stage for meaningful implementation of the standards required by Senator Gillibrand and Representative Pappas of that. The first lesson that we learned is that polluters are required to disclose that they're discharging PFAS. And if they do not, then their discharges are illegal. When the Department of Environmental Quality sued Chemours, that was their primary complaint, that Chemours had not disclosed their PFAS discharges. That led to a settlement that Southern Environmental Law Center entered into with the state and Chemours on behalf of our client, Cape Fear River Watch, that will lead to a cleanup of Chemours site. Chemours is a major manufacturer of PFAS, and over the last several decades, DuPont and Chemours have contaminated the air, groundwater, sediment. They've contaminated the Cape Fear River. They've contaminated streams on site. And using the power of that disclosure requirement and that enforcement action, we were able to enter into a settlement that will require a company to clean up all of those pathways. Which it not only gives permitting agencies an important tool, requiring polluters to disclose their PFAS puts the burden back where it should be, because we should be asking more of the dischargers, more polluting companies, and not of the communities downstream. The people in Wilmington and in Brunswick County had no idea that these chemicals were in their water. Chemours and DuPont knew all along. That's where we have to put the responsibility. And if we do that, then we can ask the Clean Water Act requires polluters to control their pollution. And so while we wait for national standards, the Clean Water Act has a provision that allows for site-specific standards, that allows permitting agencies like the EPA or your state permitting agency to consider technology that can be applied to a specific site. And coming out of the state of North Carolina's enforcement action, we know that that technology works. When we talk about hazardous levels of PFAS, we often talk in the 10s or 20s of parts per trillion. The technology that Chemours has installed at their facility is taking PFAS levels that are in the hundreds of thousands of parts per trillion to levels that are not detectable. So we know the technology is there. The legal tools are there to require companies to use it. And if EPA and if state agencies use these tools that are in the Clean Water Act, that have been in the Clean Water Act for 50 years, if they use them, then when we have national standards that set nationwide technology limits and set nationwide health standards, we'll know who's discharging PFAS. We'll know where to go to apply those standards. We'll know which communities we need to target to make sure that their drinking water has PFAS removed entirely or at a safe level. And so it's critical that this bill move forward, but we can't overlook what we can do now. And so those are the two ways in which we can take action now to make this bill an even greater success. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for those insightful comments, Christine and Jeff. I really appreciate that. A couple questions from the audience. One is a baseline question, which is, where do PFAS originate from?
Either we can jump in. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say they're entirely man-made. They're not natural. They're entirely man-made. So they come from places like Chemours.
Yeah, and just to emphasize it, as we say, PFAS are forever chemicals. They are also literally found in everything. So from household products, nonstick cookware, personal care items, food packaging, and firefighting foam that have been used by the Department of Defense. They literally show up across the board, and ultimately they get flushed back in through water, which brings us to this conversation. But they are incredibly ubiquitous. They're used across the board, and they are persistent in our blood and as well as in the environment.
And has their use in these products reduced since, it's been, the awareness has increased?
So it's unfortunately, as we say, PFAS are being manufactured and processed at significant levels. That's why we are here to talk about the critical need to regulate PFAS. As I mentioned in my statement, there are various ways in which this needs to be approached. Multiple statutes that we can target this, in which EPA has started, to take action on this, but is doing it unfortunately quite slowly. So we really have new PFAS that are, being approved, that are active. We have close to 1,000 PFAS that are active in commerce. They are continuously being used and produced in products. So we are not seeing them go away.
And I would just add, I think that's the importance, that emphasizes the importance of putting the burden back on the industries to disclose what they're discharging, because as soon as agencies and the scientific community catch up to the last PFAS, industry has already moved on. They're creating a different version, there might be a slight chemical change. And if we don't put the burden back on industry, we'll never catch up.
Speaking of the burden that you mentioned, we have a question from Lou Galario. What about punishing and boycotting the companies and the banks that fund and profit from PFAS?
Yeah, that's a good question. I fully support the boycotting of the financial investments into these products. I think unfortunately right now we are just seeing an influx and companies, and they're going to continue to produce and manufacture these chemicals. So I think it just sort of brings us back to the importance of really needing to implement regulations and setting hard deadlines, because again, PFAS are literally everywhere. They're not going away. As much as we would love to see, the lack of resources being put into these, for the same reasons, right, that they are persistent. They have been useful for companies because they repel oil and they repel water. So we see them in so many different products, but we know that there are options for PFAS-free alternatives, and that's what we really need to see them move to.
And I'll just tag on that. I think if industry is required to take responsibility for the PFAS that it's discharging, then that's an added cost to industry, and that cost is back where it should be. And what we have seen at smaller scales is that sometimes that causes product substitutions. It causes a different using different kinds of chemicals. So it's one way to put financial pressure on industry to take more responsibility.
Our next question comes from Ev Cruden with E&E News. Is there a scenario in which regulation proponents would accept subgroup regulation, i.e., regulations targeting PFAS in smaller groups rather than as an entire class of thousands?
So we absolutely support the EPA regulating PFAS as a class. Using a class-based approach is really what is necessary at this point. I think it really causes more harm than good to start regulating by, in a chemical by chemical situation or by subgroups. There are thousands of PFAS in existence. As I mentioned, close to 1,000 active in commerce. PFAS have been widely studied. If we want to understand them better scientifically, so we want to study them in subgroups, that's one thing, but it's not necessary in regulating them. And EPA has plenty of toxicity data to justify regulating them as a class. And if we're only looking at a few, then, for water, for example, we're still leaving communities contaminated because there are thousands of other PFAS chemicals that we are not looking to. So we think it's really necessary for them to use a class-based approach.
And I think that I'll echo Christine's comments. I think it's important for two other reasons. One is that nobody is exposed to one of these. What we have seen is when they show up in communities drinking water, they show up in bunches. And so it's not so going I suppose that the groupings could be very large, but we have to account for that reality that they show up in groups. And the second thing is the technology is there to keep it out of the water in the first place, and the technology can control pollutants across the spectrum. And so we should be keeping it out of the water so that we don't have to dig into the different subgroups that are possible, because it shouldn't be there in the first place.
And if I could just quickly add that, to his point, when we see PFAS discharges, oftentimes they are discharged in complex mixtures. So again, it's going to be incredibly challenging to fully protect the environment and human health if we are only approaching a few of those at a time. And PFAS is able to regulate chemicals in classes for things like common traits and harm, risk harms, which we know that various PFAS that we have studied clearly show that they bioaccumulate in our blood, that they are persistent in the environment. So we have the data, again, to regulate PFAS as a class.
This question came in earlier, but I'm going to ask you. Barbara Walsh asks, in addition to publicly owned treatment works effluent, do the proposed bills address established limits for PFAS in biosolids? I assume they mean Pfas and Gillibrand's bills, if you know this.
I don't think I have the answer to that. I apologize.
So I think that they don't directly address it, but what happens is that with the pre-treatment standards, if we keep the PFAS out of the wastewater that's coming into the wastewater treatment plant, then it'll keep it out of the biosolids. And so that's one way to control it.
A question from Kathy Kwasniewski. What amount do agricultural runoff contribute to PFAS contamination?
So I can.
Oh, sorry, Jim.
It can be significant. Actually, my water comes from a reservoir that has no industrial discharges, and there are measurable PFAS in that reservoir from the spreading of biosolids on agricultural fields. So it can be a significant source. We've seen that in other places in North Carolina as well.
We've got a lot of great questions for you. Velma Campbell asks, when we say PFAS are everywhere, how does that relate to the fact that some communities are much more contaminated than others?
Well, I think, there are a couple of things, depending on the areas in which we have facilities and manufacturers and processors, they're going to be more likely to be discharging significant amounts of PFAS or releasing PFAS in those particular communities. It's also a matter of data and of knowledge and of awareness, and which brings us back to the need for disclosure. Listing, Congress has required the EPA to list a set amount of PFAS on the toxics release inventory, which essentially provides transparency to communities so that they do know which PFAS and in what quantities companies are releasing them. Unfortunately, we just don't necessarily have the full scope of data, but we have seen plenty of tests and studies to show the significant impact of PFAS on communities, and communities like in Fayetteville and Wilmington, North Carolina, with Chemours and Hoosick Falls. It just shows up differently, and obviously depending again on where those facilities are located.
Well, thank you both. I mean, the questions since you came on have been pouring in, and unfortunately we can't get to all of them. Maybe we can find ways to get those questions to you and get them out later.
Absolutely.
But we really appreciate both of your time and your work, consistent work on this issue. It's a very important issue, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Now that we've learned a bit more from Christine and Jeff, we now have Michelle Mabson, who is a staff scientist for the Healthy Communities Program at Earth Justice, and Sergio Kaweke, an organizer with Defend Our Health. Michelle and Sergio, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. So thank you all to everyone who's joined us today. And I'd first like to start off by thanking both Congressman Pappas and Senator Gillibrand for their important work on this issue of regulating PFAS in our drinking water. And again, thanking the organizers for joining us today and hosting this town hall. So Earth Justice has worked at the federal level on a number of issues related to PFAS, including to compel EPA to stop allowing companies to avoid safety review processes for the manufacturing of new PFAS, which may be toxic as well as those have already been phased out or banned, and they may also end up in our drinking water. But nevertheless, the widespread use of PFAS means that they can be found in a stunning number of items. And we've already mentioned items including nonstick objects like cookware and food packaging, but also in stain-resistant items like the carpet, clothing, and paper, and even personal care products like makeup. And well beyond their consumer uses, PFAS are used in industrial applications, including the synthesis of pesticides and as a surfactant aid in firefighting foam. And as my colleague Christine mentioned earlier, they can be produced as a byproduct in industrial incineration practices, leading to airborne emissions of PFAS that studies have shown have the ability to be transported by air up to 25 miles away from their original source. So in other words, if we're going to address PFAS in our drinking water, we must also consider the nexus between air emissions and their eventual deposition into communities that don't even have a known source of PFAS contamination. Scientists have been able to determine our exposure to these chemicals using blood and serum samples. And the National Health and Nutrition Examination surveys have shown that over 95% of the general population have some measurable amounts of PFAS in our blood. And this data has been collected over the course of several decades, which shows that there is a benefit to phasing out PFAS like Gen X, and that there's a decreasing level of these chemicals detected in our blood. These chemicals are also linked to a number of health effects, and we've talked about some earlier, but I'll also mention immune suppression, liver disease, thyroid disease, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and preeclampsia, as well as increased cholesterol levels. And there's even emerging evidence that shows that elevated blood levels of certain PFAS chemicals can be linked to increased risk of developing a more severe form of COVID. And while we understand that most of us are exposed to varying levels, it's often low-income communities and communities of color that are burdened by these chemicals and other environmental pollution. It's nearly 1.6 million people of color who live within 5 miles of a site contaminated with PFAS, and many of these are industrial or military sites. And moreover, the reality is that for many communities, PFAS contamination is not the only environmental pollution source of concern. In 2019, the NEJAC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, submitted a set of recommendations that ask EPA to address PFAS contamination. And for additional context, NEJAC is a federal advisory committee tasked with providing EPA with advice to work to improve the health of communities that are disproportionately burdened by environmental pollution. The letter also cited Flint, Michigan, and the ongoing issues with drinking water, noting that in addition to lead and Legionella health impacts, groundwater testing found PFAS levels over 500 times the action levels set by the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. The letter goes on to urge EPA to set federally enforceable standards that protect public health, much like we want to do here. I'd like to transition a bit and discuss some considerations that we can all make and take in limiting our exposure, at least personally, to PFAS. And again, we mentioned nonstick cookware that typically contains PFAS, so opting for cast iron or stainless steel cookware is an option. And if you're able to have your receipts emailed or not printed at all, you'd be avoiding PFAS, at least dermal exposure, because PFAS is added often to receipt paper. Items like food packaging may also contain PFAS, and products like microwave popcorn bags tend to be lined with PFAS, as do other grease-resistant packaging, including those other food containers. And some companies like Sweetgreen and Chipotle have committed to phasing out their use of PFAS-lined containers, which is a very important step. But in addition to those issues, of course, our drinking water is where we're also concerned. And there are studies that have shown that reverse osmosis and even activated carbon filters can help remove PFAS at the tap. I always say that the research is out there and it can help us make informed decisions, but the reality is that even with these personal choices, we need strong federal regulations and we need to support legislation like the Clean Water Standards for PFAS Act. So, and to close, I would like to once again thank both Congressman Pappas and Senator Gillibrand for their work on these issues and understanding that all communities have the right to safe, clean, and affordable water. The legacy of PFAS contamination, coupled with the growing body of evidence of new and entirely preventable releases of PFAS, including those practices like incineration, only increases the urgency to monitor for and to set health-based standards for PFAS in our drinking water. All right, thank you so much. I'll turn it back to Mark or to Sergio.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Mark and Green Latinos, the Southern Environmental Law Center and Justice for hosting this important town hall. And also thank you for the leadership of Congressman Pappas and Senator Gillibrand on this important work around regulating the limits for industry so they don't pollute the water across the nation. As Mark said, my name is Sergio Kaweke, and I'm an organizer at Defend Our Health. Defend Our Health is a main-based organization, and we work to make sure that everybody has equal access to safe drinking water, safe food, and safe products. We started working on the PFAS contamination issue across the state of Maine a little over 2 years ago, when we learned that the state of Maine was encouraging the use of sludge spreading as soil enhancers since 1970 or since the 70s. So sludge is this waste material that remains after the treatment of industrial and domestic water. And the state was telling farmers that they could use that as soil enhancer and that it was also going to help get rid of that waste from municipalities. So it was kind of a two birds, one stone kind of solution. So farmers were spraying this sludge without knowing that it was highly contaminated with PFAS and that they were also contaminating the soil and the underground water. This second point is really important in the state of Maine because more than half of the population in Maine relies on underground water without any restrictions or any requirements around testing or remediation. If there's an underground water problem issue or contamination issue, a lot of people are going to be exposed to it without knowing. So for the last 2 years or so, we've been working on raising awareness and education around the issues of PFAS contamination in the state of Maine. And we've been working with impacted communities and impacted folks on, again, raising awareness and education, but also pushing the Department of Environmental Protection in the state to offer more testing, investigate the sources of contamination across the state, because we know that at least 500 sites have been receiving this sludge historically, and also offering filtration systems to impacted folks, because we don't think the families should be responsible for to pay for filtration systems where they are not responsible for the contamination in the first place. But acknowledging that this is also a statewide problem and that a lot of people are impacted by it, we also worked on legislation at the state level. This session, we have a very productive and successful session where we were pushing for 7 pieces of legislation. We are still waiting for a couple of them to be signed and become a law, but we're very optimistic about that. And just to mention a couple that I think are relevant to this conversation. One of the pieces of legislation that we were working on was to set up a more health protective and stronger maximum contaminant level for PFAS in drinking water. So we're moving away from the old and not health protective enough 70 part per trillion from the EPA as an advisory level, and we're establishing a 20 part per trillion for a combination of 6 compounds in Maine. So we're following the work of states like Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, and we think that that's a step in the right direction, and there's a lot more work to be done. Also, kind of related to the conversation, we also passed a piece of legislation at the state level that prohibits the use of PFAS in non-essential products. So we're moving away from the root cause of contamination by moving to safer alternatives whenever that's available. So I think those are really important pieces of legislation at the state level. And again, there's other states also doing similar work that I think is super important. And I also want to mention that, as I said before, we've been working with impacted communities across the state, and without their leadership and their work, and without people speaking up and sharing the stories, we couldn't have been successful in pushing all this legislation. Because we know that it is by sharing stories and telling, how people are being affected and impacted by these issues on the ground that we can generate public support, but also show legislators that there's a real issue on the ground and that we need real solutions now. So we had people who are impacted by these issues come to the State House and provide public testimony, share their stories. And that was extremely emotional, but also compelling, an eye-opener. And legislators realized that this is an important issue that is impacting people on the ground. And I think that's part of the reason why we were able to pass all this legislation in the state of Maine. So we know that these are tactics and strategies that work and that are effective. So we also had people submitting letters to the editor, writing op-eds, both on their local newspapers and statewide newspapers, people talking to neighbors, family, friends about this issue. Kind of we were creating like a public narrative to make sure that people could understand the magnitude of the issue and the need for real solutions now. So I want to encourage to everybody watching right now, if you have been impacted by PFAS contamination in your drinking water, in your land, or if you're a strong advocate for safer and clean environment, I encourage you to look at the links that we're sharing on the chat and that we're going to email afterwards to people. There's some really cool fact sheets, and there's a toolkit where you're going to find ways in which you can help us influence the narrative and really speak up about the importance of these solutions and how big this issue is across the nation. So if you can talk to your friends, family, neighbors about this, you can share your stories, reach out to your legislators and talk to them, write letters to the editor or op-eds, and kind of help us put this out in the public. This is very helpful in pushing for policy and getting these solutions implemented. We know that the squeakiest wheel is the one that gets the oil, and if we draw attention and we keep sharing these stories, we're going to get the solutions that we're demanding for. So I'm going to wrap up there, so we have some time for questions. And again, thank you, Mark and Green Latinos.
And there are a lot of questions, a lot of interest in the words you've been saying. Sergio and Michelle, thank you for that, and a lot of support out there for the work that you're doing as they've been hearing about it. I'd like to start off with a question from Melissa Aguayo. As someone who's learning more about this issue, it's hard not to feel overwhelmed when discussing PFAS. What can we do to protect ourselves and our families? And as an advocate, what should we be lifting for other advocates? And what should we be asking, demanding for from our electeds and industry?
I can speak about the second part of the question. And I think, we definitely want the government to set more regulations and strongest standards for PFAS in water and PFAS in discharge of, industry. And I think something we can do is, again, raise awareness, education, talk to people. This is something people don't know a lot about. And I think talking about it and sharing information with people goes really a long way. And, again, writing letters to the editor and op-ed so people can have more information and we can kind of spread this publicly also goes a long way. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do. And again, there's a lot more information on the toolkit and fact sheets that, if people are interested. And also if people have more questions about the legislation or about the tactics or what to do, they can also reach out to Green Latinos, to Defend Our Health, or to the Southern Environmental Law Center and their justice, and we'll be more than happy to plug you in the work and help you kind of advocate and speak up about these issues as well.
And just to answer that as well, not to introduce more information that you'd have to go and look into, but there are trackers that at least help us begin to understand what might be the extent of where a person is located and in their community where there may be some PFAS that has been detected in drinking water. I think at the Environmental Working Group, there's that type of interactive map and tracking exists. And so you can take a look at your community and find out if there's contamination, number one. And I think I've mentioned somewhat in my discussion, but there are treatment systems. They do cost. They're costly, and I think that we have to have that conversation about costs and making sure folks have access who may be in communities that can't afford treatments like reverse osmosis or filtration systems. That ultimately those filtration systems are not. They have to be replaced. So that's an additional level of cost. But there are companies that are phasing out the use of PFAS in their products. And that's something that we also need to make sure we're accountable to. I know this conversation is about drinking water, but ultimately in the disposal process, all of these items are going to end up in a site that can possibly reintroduce the PFAS contaminants back into the environment and back into our drinking water. So there has to be a sense of urgency around looking at what else we can do in our consumer-based products and our own personal use of products that may contain PFAS. Also, again, as I mentioned, the tracking is out there, so you can begin to learn and unearth what may be sites in your community to be of concern. And to, again, as my colleague here mentioned, having these regulations that we are accountable to begin to also collect additional data, especially on the newer PFAS that are being manufactured and emitted.
Thank you. Speaking of consumer-facing products, Diana Rodriguez asks, are there incentives to develop environmentally safe alternative materials to replace PFAS? Or are there campaigns to instruct the public about what other options they have besides things like non-stick material like Teflon. How can we curb the demand for these materials so there's no need for companies to keep manufacturing them?
So in the mentioning of the phase out of some of these products, especially in packaging, it has been the demands from consumers that has really driven companies to think about their responsibility, not only because, for instance, with Sweetgreen's packaging, they claim to be compostable, but as you can imagine, if you have PFAS on packaging, composting directly introduces that PFAS right back into the soil and potentially getting into groundwater sources. And so that public education component, I think, has been really valuable in incentivizing. I think we obviously need more in terms of actually regulating and reducing the amount that would require agencies like the FDA's involvement in the Consumer Product Safety Commission. But that public awareness piece, I think, is really critical. It's been what's driven a large amount of phase outs that we have seen. And also, of course, when we look at industrial sources, it's been that high level of contamination that's been detected in water sources like the Chemours plant that we've been able, that was mentioned earlier, where that type of widespread community contamination is being addressed at a multitude of levels, including at the state and federal level.
Just to add to that, and something I didn't mention is, we also work on market-based campaigns, and we are part of coalitions across the nation that also do that, where we're holding industry accountable for the use of PFAS in products, and we're calling specific industries to move away from these toxic chemicals and use safer alternatives when possible. So that's another way in which we can incentivize market. We already know that there's safer alternatives available, so it's all about implementing those and changing to them. So that's another way in which we can move away from the use of toxic chemicals in products as well. But ultimately, I also think we need federal regulation so that everybody follows those moves away from toxic chemicals.
Well, Michelle and Sergio, the chat and the Q&A are burning up, and people have more questions than we can answer in this short time, and more applause for the work that you're doing and the information that you're sharing. And I'm sure the 150 guests that we had today are going to be activists after this and increase their information and education of their communities as well. So thank you for joining us. And it looks like we're coming to the end of the town hall. I want to thank everyone who participated today. Thank you so much to Senator Gillibrand and Congressman Pappas, and thank you to our panelists, all of them. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Please don't forget to check out the PFAS Response Toolkit on our Green Latinos website under Media Resources. We're also putting the link in the chat. We hope you consider getting involved and adding your voice to the conversation. We will also be sending a recap email with all of the resources shared today to everyone. Thank you all, mil gracias, and see you next time. Hasta luego. Ciao.